On March 19, 1997, Arthur Napoleon Raymond Robinson, fondly referred to as A.N.R. Robinson, was sworn in as the third president of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. It was momentous, and it was precedent-setting.
Never before in our short history as an independent country did we have an elected member of parliament representing a particular party becoming the head of state of the country. The head of state is supposed to be the embodiment of all the people in the country, no matter what their political affiliations are. So that in the past you had a judge, I think, you had a high public servants, very senior public servants, and judges and so on, but not politicians, partisan politicians as such. So that to that extent it was a surprise.
It was surprising that because at the time he was Minister Plenipotentiary, and it was surprising that he was nominated by the government to be president.
It represented a new era in the office of president. He was a politician.
You don't have an active politician being made president. At least that is not part of the expectation.
It represented a change in what was the norm. Here you had Mr. Robinson, who was a sitting member of parliament, being nominated to the position of president. Again, there's nothing illegal against it. The Constitution doesn't forbid it. There's no law against it. But it was outside of the norm, and it never happened before.
The political significance is that Basdio Pandey won the government as a result of the beneficence of Mr. Robinson, along with, of course, Pamela Nicholson. And, of course, it was the first time, wasn't it, that the UNC was winning power in Trinidad and Tobago.
Mr. Robinson had served as the Prime Minister of the country prior to his appointment as President, and Mr. Pandey was having his turn, and they were collaborating with each other, so that it was a matter of political accommodation between both gentlemen that he lent Tobago's support to the UNC government, and in return he was given this office of president.
In a career dedicated to public service, Mr. Robinson personified many of the qualities expected of a head of state.
We should be looking for a person who is the embodiment of all the virtues that are required of someone who wants to be in public life. And I think Mr. Robinson had those virtues.
I think a president needs to be the conscience of the nation. And that, I think, is where we are a diverse society, and therefore being the conscience of the nation means that you are able to demonstrate that all aspects of the cross-section of the society can feel confident that the president is someone who actually can reflect their views by virtue of accommodating them and by virtue of respecting the diversity of a society such as ours. And that would make the person the conscience of the nation.
You have a national image. You have a track record of connecting with the public and impressing in the public's mind a personality that can show resilience, understanding, empathy, firmness, courage, and more than ever, more important than anything else, that you are above the partisan politics and you have absolutely no inclination to be called a president of this government or a president of that government.
I think the presidents ought to be an inspiration and a role model for the country and society in general.
You also need somebody who could be apolitical in the sense that they are not partisan. They are for the people, all the people, without partisan political influence in the decisions that they make. One understands, of course, that all presidents are appointed by the ruling party. But when you become the president after being so appointed, you need to be perceived and to present yourself as somebody who is not towing some political line.
Not because you are a partisan politician in one iteration, in one instance, you do not qualify to be the head of state. If you have the character, and in my view, Mr. Robinson had the character to become a head of state. And indeed, in his period of service as head of state, he in fact demonstrated that he was prepared to rise above the partisan politics.
It was tumultuous to a certain extent, having regard to the differences of opinion from between him and Mr. Pandey.
What emerged were some very public difficulties between himself and Mr. Pandey. So Mr. Robinson, in many respects, was asserting his independence of the Prime Minister.
He did try to bring a more authoritative position to the office of president. You will recall that he bucked Pandey on the appointment of failed members in the election. Eventually he had to go ahead with it, but I think what is important there is the principle. He couldn't stop it indefinitely, but he did take a stance and he did make a point, and I think it resonated with the public.
I think Mr. Robinson had a very tumultuous presidential term. He was the first elected MP to become the president. It was clear that he and Mr. Pandey, who had had their difficulties in the 86-91 Parliament, and then made peace in 1995 after the general election. They resumed their difficult relationship during his presidency. And I think that he helped to bring Mr. Pandey into power in 1995, and he helped to remove Mr. Pandey from power in 2001.
However, Mr. Robinson's presidency was not without controversy.
I think his term established some new boundaries because of his sternness. I think even in the 1818 result, in which he nominated Manning, demonstrated part of his thinking when he said the preamble to the Constitution talks about moral and spiritual values.
The word to describe it is memorable. When one remembers his speech, you know, moral and spiritual values and rivers and streams, it was memorable. And generally speaking, I would say it was satisfactory to me.
Mr. Robinson stretched the powers of the presidency to the limit in terms of delaying but not refusing advice that was tendered. And I think that the elasticity that he brought to the powers of the presidency to show that he could delay and refuse to act on advice immediately.
I think that Mr. Robinson was a good president, save and except in the 1818 tie situation. There continues to be divided opinion as to whether he was correct in selecting the PNM rather than the UNC. There are those who feel very strongly that he he ignored convention, well-established convention, and his emphasis was, or rather his focus, was on moral and spiritual values. And there are those who contend that moral and spiritual values can be part and parcel of convention, that it is superior to convention. And where you have the issues of moral and the issue of moral and spiritual values in focus, that precedence should be given and serious consideration should be given to moral and spiritual values as opposed to established convention. Remember, convention is not law. It has deep and strong persuasive influence, but it is not law.
And I think Robinson tried to bring a different culture to the presidency. He tried to establish some new precedents, which I thought all in all were useful attempts to bring new life and new authority to the office of president, which previously was seen as purely ceremonial.